Welcome to the historic Blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe. Not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. Now beginning. Story 1. The Corsican Roots of Napoleon Bonaparte. Corsica, a rugged island jutting out from the Mediterranean, shaped by winds and waves and generations of rebellion. In 1769, this mountainous land had only just been pried from the grasp of the Genoese and absorbed into the Kingdom of France. That same year, a child was born in the town of Ajaccio, Napoleon de Bonaparte. To understand Napoleon Bonaparte, one must begin not with cannon fire or sweeping armies, but with quiet stone villages, olive groves, and the ever-present awareness of foreign domination. Corsica was not French in spirit, it was fiercely independent and deeply influenced by Italian culture. The island had been a crucible of revolution and autonomy, led by the legendary Pasquale Paoli. It was into this conflicted space that the Bonaparte family emerged, positioning themselves as both Corsican patriots and, eventually, French citizens. Napoleon's father, Carlo Bonaparte, navigated this dual identity with calculated pragmatism. A minor noble in the Corsican context, Carlo allied with the new French rulers, securing a modest but significant role as a representative to the court of Louis XVI. This decision would grant his children access to elite French institutions, but at the cost of their Corsican nationalist credentials. It was a compromise born not from loyalty, but survival. The family lived in relative comfort but far from wealth. Their nobility was thin, recognized by French law, but not backed by land or influence. The tension between appearance and reality, between identity and ambition, would mark young Napoleon's early years. At home, the family spoke Italian and Corsican dialects. At school in France, he would be mocked for his accent, his manners, and his name. He was, in every way, a foreigner in the land that would become his empire. Sent to the military college at Brienne-le-Chateau at the age of 9, Napoleon entered a world of strict discipline, social hierarchy, and cultural alienation. His classmates, mostly sons of old French aristocracy, scorned his provincial background. Napoleon was often alone, reading voraciously, particularly the histories of Plutarch. He admired the great leaders of antiquity, especially Caesar and Alexander, not for their glory, but for their ability to rise from obscurity. He learned to endure. He studied mathematics, geography, and artillery disciplines that required precision and patience. These would be his tools, not the swordplay and horsemanship prized by the cavalry elite. His notebooks from this time were filled with detailed sketches of fortifications and battle formations, interspersed with gloomy reflections on injustice and power. Boredom in the barracks bred mastery, and in solitude he plotted his ascent. It is worth noting that Napoleon's rise was not inevitable. In fact, his early career could have easily been swallowed by the anonymous machinery of the French military. His first commission was as a second lieutenant in the artillery, stationed in Valence, a quiet, administrative post that offered little prestige. Here, Napoleon spent much of his time reading, writing political essays, and avoiding debt. His opinions were already radical. He admired Rousseau and openly criticized the monarchy. In 1789, as revolution broke out in France, Napoleon was on leave in Corsica. He threw himself into the revolutionary cause with enthusiasm, aligning initially with Paoli and the Corsican nationalists. He believed that liberty and republicanism could finally free Corsica from domination. But idealism soon gave way to disappointment. Paoli, ever wary of French interference, grew distrustful of the Bonapartes' loyalties. The alliance fractured. Napoleon was eventually declared a traitor by Corsican authorities. Forced to flee the island with his family in 1793, Napoleon landed once more in France, this time as an exile, rejected by his homeland. It was a bitter turning point. Corsica, the land of his birth, had spurned him. France, which had never fully accepted him, was now his only option. With little money, few connections, and no prospects, Napoleon returned to the army. And yet, it was precisely this moment, this quiet, unceremonious low point, that planted the seeds of what was to come. The revolution had swept away the old hierarchy. Officers had fled or been executed. The army was in disarray. Ambitious, skilled men, no matter their origin, suddenly had room to rise. Napoleon, a brilliant but overlooked artillery officer, found himself in a country desperate for leadership. But could he shake the shadows of his Corsican past? Could a man born to a marginal noble family on a rebel island truly become the leader of a nation in revolution? And what would he need to give up, what identities, allegiances, and illusions to climb that ladder? The year was 1793. Revolutionary France was spiraling through chaos and reinvention. King Louis XVI had been executed. The reign of terror was beginning its grim procession. And amidst the turmoil, Napoleon Bonaparte, exiled from Corsica, unemployed and bitter, stood poised at the edge of opportunity. His return to France was not triumphant. The Bonapartes settled in Marseille, nearly destitute. But the upheaval of the revolution had created a vacuum, particularly in the military. The flight of aristocratic officers meant that promotion, once locked behind noble birth, was suddenly open to competence. And if Napoleon Bonaparte had anything to offer, it was competence. It was the siege of Toulon that first elevated him from obscurity. In the autumn of 1793, royalist rebels in Toulon invited the British Navy to seize the port, one of the most strategically important in the Mediterranean. The revolutionary government could not afford to lose it. The siege was chaotic, badly planned, and lacked direction. But among the army was a young captain of artillery, Napoleon, who saw what the generals had not. With his sharp grasp of topography and ballistics, he proposed a detailed plan: seize key hills overlooking the harbor, reposition the artillery, and drive the British fleet away with targeted cannon fire. It was not a bold cavalry charge or sweeping infantry maneuver. It was slow, calculated siegecraft, measured and mechanical. It required knowledge of terrain, physics, and patience. Napoleon's plan was approved by sheer desperation, and its success was undeniable. The British withdrew. Toulon fell. And with it, Napoleon was promoted to brigadier general at the age of 24. The victory was not glamorous. It was a battle of angles, supply lines, and artillery positions. But it was precisely this mastery of the dull mechanics of war that separated Napoleon from others. He understood that wars were not only won by courage or inspiration, but by logistics, calculations, and relentless attention to detail. He wrote extensively during this period, not only military notes, but also political commentary. In these early writings, we see the formation of his belief in centralized authority, efficiency, and control. He was already distancing himself from the revolutionary ideals of popular participation. For Napoleon, the revolution had provided opportunity, but it was not an end in itself. It was a ladder. Following Toulon, his reputation grew. He was appointed commander of the artillery for the Army of Italy, though the post came with limited resources and even less respect. The Army of Italy was underfed, underpaid, and demoralized. But once again, Napoleon turned apparent weakness into an advantage. He took meticulous stock of supplies, reorganized logistics, and used charisma, propaganda, and discipline to reshape the ragged forces into something resembling an army. Still, fortune is rarely linear. In 1794, his patron Robespierre fell during the Thermidorian reaction. Napoleon, associated with the Jacobin regime, was arrested briefly. His rise was suddenly halted not by failure, but by political realignment. For months he lingered in bureaucratic limbo, a general without a post. He spent the time in Paris, immersing himself in politics and society. He wrote essays on government, economics, and even romantic fiction. He networked discreetly, cultivating relationships with rising political figures. Among them was Paul Barras, a leading figure of the Directory, the post-terror governing body. And then came another opportunity, strangely bureaucratic and domestic in nature. In October 1795, Royalists and reactionaries attempted to overthrow the Directory in what became known as the 13 Vendémiaire uprising. The government needed a reliable military commander to defend the capital. Barras turned to Napoleon. What followed was swift and efficient. Napoleon deployed artillery at strategic intersections throughout Paris. When the uprising began, he ordered grapeshot fired into the charging crowds. It was not heroic, nor particularly noble, but it was decisive. The rebellion was crushed in a single day. Paris fell silent under the weight of cannon smoke. This event, sometimes called the whiff of grapeshot, marked Napoleon's return to favor. He was promoted again and granted command of the Army of the Interior. More importantly, it made him a known figure in Parisian political circles. It also introduced him to Joséphine de Beauharnais, a widow of an executed aristocrat and lover of Paul Barras. Their courtship was quick, their marriage calculated. Joséphine offered social connections and a more polished presence. Napoleon offered ambition and rising status. Though his letters to her were filled with poetic fervor, theirs was a union shaped as much by strategic alliance as by passion. With his new post came new plans. In 1796, he was appointed commander of the Army of Italy not as an advisor, but as the general in charge. This was no mere frontier army. The campaign would decide France's influence over northern Italy and, by extension, the security of its southern borders. The region had long been a web of small kingdoms, duchies, and ancient traditions ripe for conquest, but perilous to navigate. Napoleon found the army as he had left it, unpaid, undersupplied, and fragmented. But he inspired them with promises of glory, loot, and revolution. He wrote stirring proclamations to his troops, often inflated, always effective. He led from the front, directing battle formations personally, moving quickly between units, issuing precise instructions. But again, it was not his charisma alone that won victories, it was logistics. He reorganized supply routes, used local resources with brutal efficiency, and negotiated directly with Italian officials to secure roads and towns. His letters to the Directory were filled with detailed accounts not of noble speeches or battlefield poetry, but of food stores, bridge construction, and ration counts. The army was fed, paid, and victorious. Each battle Montagnat, Lodi, Arkel built upon the last. The Austrians were driven back. Satellite republics were established in place of monarchies. French influence spread like ink across the maps of northern Italy. It was during this time that Napoleon began to see himself not only as a servant of France, but as a shaper of Europe. He corresponded with philosophers, artists, and engineers. He traveled with scientists and administrators, laying the groundwork for civil reforms. Even as battles raged, he reorganized municipal governments, introduced new currencies, and founded libraries and schools. And yet, beneath the reforms and rhetoric was a cold, mechanical understanding of power. Napoleon respected culture and intellect, but he believed in authority. Where revolution had been chaotic, he offered structure. Where ideals had faltered, he provided results. But would this combination of military discipline and civil engineering last? Could his style of governance hold when the fighting stopped? And would France, the fractured, revolutionary France, accept leadership from a man who increasingly acted like a monarch in all but name? By 1797, Napoleon Bonaparte was no longer just a name in military dispatches. He was a phenomenon, a general who had not only conquered territories but also rewritten their laws, restructured their economies, and left behind governments that looked suspiciously French. The Italian campaign was more than a string of victories. It was a laboratory for Napoleon's political philosophy, a testbed for power that extended far beyond the battlefield. The Treaty of Campo Formio, signed in October 1797, officially ended hostilities between France and Austria. Its terms were complex, but the essence was straightforward. France would gain territory, most notably the Austrian Netherlands and the left bank of the Rhine, while Austria would receive the territory of Venice. It was a cold, calculated arrangement, a balance of conquest dressed in diplomacy. What was striking, however, was how much of the treaty had been shaped by Napoleon himself. Despite being a military commander, he had personally negotiated with Austrian envoys. The Directory had little control over the process. He reported to them, yes, but on his own terms, often after decisions were already made. This independent streak was a warning of what was to come. But instead of returning to Paris to bask in glory, Napoleon chose a curious detour, an expedition to Egypt. Why Egypt? The official reason was to strike a blow against British interests by threatening their trade routes to India. But there were deeper motives: cultural, political, and personal. Egypt represented the exotic allure of empire, the chance to be seen not merely as a general, but as a builder of civilizations. It was also conveniently far from the increasingly wary Directory. The Egyptian campaign, 1798–1799, was a study in contradictions. Militarily, it began with success, the capture of Alexandria and the stunning victory at the Battle of the Pyramids. But the British Navy, under Admiral Nelson, soon destroyed the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile, trapping Napoleon and his army in the region. What followed was a slow, unraveling guerrilla resistance from the locals, outbreaks of disease, and logistical nightmares. And yet, even in this flawed campaign, Napoleon continued to build. He brought with him a corps of scholars, engineers, and artists. The Institut d'Egypte was founded to study everything from ancient ruins to modern agriculture. The Description de l'Egypte, a massive scholarly work compiled from the expedition, would take decades to publish but remains one of the great accomplishments of Enlightenment-era documentation. It was here, in the middle of a failing campaign, that the Rosetta Stone was discovered, an unassuming slab that would one day unlock the language of the pharaohs. Even as the military effort crumbled, the intellectual legacy of the expedition endured. But the sands of Egypt could not hold Napoleon forever. By 1799, the political situation in France had deteriorated. The Directory was corrupt and ineffectual, caught between royalist plots and radical uprisings. Sensing opportunity, as always, Napoleon abandoned his army and returned to France in secrecy. He was welcomed not as a failure, but as a savior. In November 1799, he orchestrated a coup d'état known as the 18th Brumaire. With the help of trusted allies, including his brother Lucien and Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, Napoleon dissolved the Directory and replaced it with the Consulate, a new executive body. Of course, he placed himself at its center. Officially, he was just first consul, a title that evoked the Roman Republic. In practice, he wielded more power than any French ruler since the ancient regime. Over the next few years, he would use this position to implement sweeping reforms across France. These reforms were not dramatic in presentation, but they were revolutionary in impact. Napoleon restructured the tax system, stabilized the economy, and created the Bank of France. He established lycées to train civil servants and revived the metric system. He centralized authority, ensured laws were applied uniformly, and diminished the power of local aristocracies. The cornerstone of this transformation was the Napoleonic Code, 1804, a unified legal framework that would go on to influence legal systems across Europe and beyond. It codified property rights, civil liberties, and family law. It was simultaneously a product of Enlightenment rationalism and a tool of authoritarian control. For the average citizen, life became more orderly, predictable even. The chaos of the revolution was over. The executions, the purges, the instability replaced with a sense of structure. The streets were clean. The bureaucracy functioned. Taxes were collected. Grain reached the cities. Napoleon understood that most people, even revolutionaries, preferred predictability to chaos. He presented himself as the embodiment of both change and continuity, a ruler born of the revolution, but capable of restoring order. Still, power is a restless creature. In 1802, a referendum confirmed Napoleon as first consul for life, a move cloaked in the language of democratic approval. 2 years later, he crowned himself Emperor of the French in a ceremony dripping with symbolism. Pope Pius VII was present, but Napoleon placed the crown on his own head, signaling that his authority derived not from God, but from his own will. France had traded one monarchy for another. The revolution, with all its bloodshed and dreams, had circled back to empire. And what of Corsica? By this time, Napoleon's connection to his birthplace had faded into shadow. The island remained under French control, but its cultural and political autonomy was all but extinguished. Napoleon's Corsican identity had been not only abandoned but transformed, subsumed into the grand narrative of empire. He would never again live on the island. He would never again identify as a Corsican patriot. That version of himself had died long ago in exile, in ambition, in evolution. And yet some remnants remained. His style of governance, the reliance on family networks, the emphasis on loyalty, the centralized command echoed the values of Corsican clans. His understanding of resistance and survival, honed in the rocky hills of Ajaccio, never truly left him. In building his empire, Napoleon had outgrown Corsica, but in some ways he had also carried it with him. As Europe stared down this new emperor, neither king nor revolutionary, the question was not just how far Napoleon could go, but how long he could hold what he had built. Story 2. The French Revolution's ripple effect across Europe. When the Bastille fell on July 14, 1789, its symbolic walls collapsed not just in Paris, but across a continent. The French Revolution began as a distinctly French crisis, one of taxation, famine, and royal incompetence, but the aftershocks did not respect borders. What unfolded in France would become the crucible of modern Europe, where monarchies reeled, radicals rallied, and ordinary people watched in anxious silence. To understand the revolution's continental echo, we must first consider the political atmosphere of late 18th century Europe. It was a patchwork of kingdoms, principalities, duchies, and empires, all bound together by the legitimacy of royal blood and divine right. The Enlightenment had challenged old ideas, but rulers still governed by tradition and lineage. The French Revolution was not merely disruptive, it was existential. When Louis XVI was forced to accept a constitutional monarchy in 1791, the monarchs of Europe took notice, not because they mourned his diminished power, but because they feared for their own. The Holy Roman Empire, an antiquated conglomeration of over 300 states, viewed France's experiment with horror. Prussia, with its rigid military culture, feared the spread of radicalism. Austria, bound to the French monarchy through Marie Antoinette, saw familial disgrace and political instability in the same stroke. Still, at first, most monarchs assumed France's chaos would burn itself out. Revolutions were messy but often short-lived. What they did not expect was the revolution's tendency to consume itself and then export its flames. Inside France, the revolution grew darker. The storming of the Bastille had opened the door, but it was the march on Versailles, the execution of the king, and the rise of the Jacobins that truly horrified the crowned heads of Europe. By 1793, Louis XVI had been guillotined. The French Republic was born not as an ideal but as a blood-stained reality. This was a declaration of war not by France, but by the mere fact of its existence. In response, the first coalition was formed, a loose alliance of European powers. Austria, Prussia, Britain, Spain, and others joined forces to restore the old order. Their goal was not merely to contain France, but to extinguish the revolutionary impulse before it could take root elsewhere. Yet in their attempt to quash the revolution, the coalition inadvertently strengthened it. The French government, desperate for unity, declared La Patrie en danger, the fatherland in danger. Revolutionary fervor, which had been fragmenting, was now redirected outward. The levée en masse, the first modern mass conscription, was introduced. French armies swelled not with mercenaries but with citizens. Men who might have opposed the revolution at home now marched under its banners abroad. This was the beginning of something new, ideological warfare. For centuries, European wars had been fought over territory, succession, or trade. Now, for the first time, war was waged in the name of abstract ideals: liberty, equality, fraternity. French soldiers entered the Rhineland, Belgium, and northern Italy not just as invaders, but as liberators, or so they claimed. Of course, liberation was messy. In the Austrian Netherlands, modern-day Belgium, revolutionary forces dismantled the old institutions and imposed the French calendar, language, and law. Churches were closed, monasteries dissolved, local elites were replaced with French-appointed officials. Even weights and measures were changed. It was administration by ideology, and many locals resented it. And yet something stirred. In the German states, students and intellectuals began discussing revolutionary principles. In Italy, secret societies whispered about independence from papal and imperial control. In Poland, a constitution was drafted that echoed French ideals, though it would be short-lived. The revolution had inspired not just fear, but imitation. Meanwhile, within France, the revolution was devouring its own. The Reign of Terror, led by Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety, executed thousands. Revolutionary tribunals replaced traditional courts. Political enemies, real or imagined, were swept away. Even language was policed. Monsieur became Scythian, and suspicion lurked behind every word. But here, too, was something historically significant: the centralization of state power in the name of ideology. The machinery of governance was no longer the domain of aristocrats, but of committees, deputies, and bureaucrats. France was becoming a modern state not in peace, but through purges and planning. Abroad, monarchs watched with a mix of revulsion and envy. For all the violence, France was proving resilient. Its economy had stabilized through radical controls. Its armies were large, often victorious, and perhaps most dangerously, its ideas were infectious. In Britain, political clubs like the London Corresponding Society called for parliamentary reform. In Ireland, the United Irishmen sought a republic. In Switzerland and the Netherlands, small republican movements sprouted. Most were crushed, but the seeds had been planted. It wasn't just elites who felt the shift. In towns across Europe, tradesmen and farmers heard stories of how Paris had beheaded its king and declared that men were equal. They saw conscripted armies fighting not for a monarch but for a cause. It was confusing, terrifying, and deeply compelling. Even when the revolution turned imperial, its influence did not fade. When Napoleon rose to power, he did so not as a king, but as first consul, the servant of the Republic. His rise was cloaked in revolutionary language, even as he centralized authority. The Napoleonic Code, introduced years later, would carry revolutionary reforms across the continent, abolishing feudal privileges, codifying secular law, and promoting merit over birth. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. In 1795, as the revolution entered its sixth year, the French government, now the Directory, struggled to hold the center. The wars dragged on, the economy wavered, and yet France remained unbowed. The monarchy was gone. The map of Europe was shifting. And in the quiet streets of Vienna, Berlin, Madrid, and St. Petersburg, ordinary people began to wonder if the French could overthrow centuries of monarchy and reshape their world. What might happen if the same ideas took hold here? As France marched deeper into revolutionary territory, both figuratively and literally, its ideas began to be formalized not only through ideology, but through occupation. By the late 1790s, French armies had pushed beyond their borders and were now actively reshaping the political terrain of Europe. And they did not arrive with mere flags and muskets. They brought new calendars, new laws, and new governments. These were the sister republics. In the wake of military victories, the French did something relatively novel in European warfare. Rather than simply annexing lands or demanding tribute, they created ideologically aligned republics. These were semi-independent states, modeled on revolutionary France, often governed by locals, but under close French supervision. Though claimed as acts of liberation, they were also strategic buffers, barriers of friendly governance between France and hostile monarchies. The Batavian Republic in the Netherlands was among the first. In 1795, French forces entered the Dutch Republic amid growing local support for change. The once powerful mercantile state had stagnated under oligarchic rule. With the backing of French troops and native reformers, a republic was declared. The new government adopted a constitution influenced by French Enlightenment ideals, abolished the last vestiges of feudal law, and secularized institutions. But liberation was not without cost. The Batavian Republic paid for the French army's assistance through financial contributions. Its ports were controlled, its decisions increasingly aligned with French foreign policy. In practice, it became a client state, a republic in name, but subordinate in action. Still, it was an inspiration to many. Other republics followed. The Cisalpine Republic was carved out of northern Italy, combining Milan, Bologna, and other territories into a single political entity. It used the tricolor flag, modeled its constitution on France's, and abolished noble privileges. The Ligurian Republic replaced the centuries-old Republic of Genoa, itself already weakened by corruption and internal strife. The Helvetic Republic transformed the patchwork of Swiss cantons into a centralized, French-style state, one that abolished centuries of localized self-rule in favor of uniform governance. These new republics weren't just symbolic, they had real implications for everyday people. Local aristocrats lost their titles, clergy were often removed from state roles, guilds were dismantled, taxes were restructured. In many places, peasants gained rights they had never had before. Land reforms redistributed property. Censorship was lifted, at least briefly. Education systems were secularized and standardized. But these changes weren't universally welcomed. For many citizens, particularly in rural areas, the revolution's arrival meant conscription, new taxes, and unfamiliar laws. Traditional structures, parishes, guilds, village councils were torn apart with little warning or explanation. French administrators often seemed arrogant, indifferent to local customs. Even radicals who supported reform balked at the heavy-handedness of France's approach. Rebellions broke out in several sister republics, especially when religion was targeted. In the Vendée region of western France, resistance had already been fierce. Now similar uprisings flared in Italy and Switzerland. These revolts were crushed with brutal efficiency. France was exporting revolution, yes, but often by cannon rather than consent. And yet, even when the republics faltered, the ideas embedded in them endured. The new institutions, courts, schools, property laws began to shape a new civic identity. Young lawyers, teachers, and bureaucrats trained under these systems would go on to shape their countries long after the French had gone. They spoke of citizenship rather than subjecthood. They debated rights rather than privileges. They published pamphlets, held assemblies, and argued about liberty and equality. Meanwhile, monarchies across Europe scrambled to respond. Some doubled down on repression. In Austria, the secret police expanded surveillance on students and intellectuals. In Prussia, conservative reforms were introduced to counteract radical influence. In Russia, Catherine the Great had once admired Enlightenment philosophers but now banned books and tightened censorship. But others took a different tack. In Denmark and parts of Scandinavia, moderate reforms were adopted, modernizing legal codes, improving peasant rights, and reducing the power of the aristocracy. These weren't revolutionary acts, but they acknowledged the changing tide. Monarchs realized that total rigidity might break their systems entirely. The Catholic Church, too, struggled with its role. In territories occupied by France, the Church lost land, income, and authority. In some republics, religious festivals were banned. The revolutionary calendar even replaced saints' days with secular commemorations. Yet for many rural Europeans, faith remained central. The attempt to erase religion from public life backfired in many places, fueling counter-revolutionary movements and deepening resistance. As 1799 approached, it was clear that Europe was in a state of ideological flux. The old order was battered, but not broken. The revolutionary model had proven potent, but not universally popular. And France itself, exhausted by war, debt, and political infighting, stood at another turning point. The Directory, which had governed since the fall of Robespierre, was increasingly seen as corrupt and ineffective. Its wars continued, but its authority at home was fragile. In the streets of Paris, whispers of a new leader, a general, circulated. He had returned from Egypt. He had success in Italy. He was young, calculating, and popular with the army. His name, of course, was Napoleon Bonaparte. But what would become of the republics France had birthed? Would they evolve into lasting democracies or crumble under the weight of foreign control and internal unrest? And when Napoleon inevitably stepped forward, would he uphold the revolutionary promise, or twist it into something altogether different? By the dawn of the 19th century, it was no longer clear what exactly the French Revolution had become. The guillotine had fallen silent. The monarchy had been abolished and then replaced by something suspiciously monarchical, and France stood not just as a republic, but as the dominant military power in Europe. The revolution, once a cry of liberty from the streets of Paris, was now issuing decrees from the saddle of a general's horse. At the center of this transformation was Napoleon Bonaparte, who, in 1799, staged a bloodless coup d'etat, the 18th Brumaire, and installed himself as first consul of the Republic. In theory, France remained a revolutionary state. In practice, it had just crowned a new kind of monarch. Under Napoleon, the rhetoric of revolution was retained, but the machinery was retooled. Gone were the chaotic assemblies and shifting alliances of earlier years. In their place came centralized governance, swift legal reform, and meticulous control. The Constitution of the year VIII, approved in a heavily manipulated plebiscite, created the consulate, a triumvirate in name, but with all real power invested in Napoleon. The irony was not lost on observers. The revolution had overthrown absolute monarchy, only to birth a government where one man once again held unchallenged authority. But this time, he claimed his legitimacy not from divine right but from the will of the people. This was the revolution's most enduring legacy. It had redefined power itself. In the past, rulers had ruled because of who they were. Now they ruled because of what they could claim to represent the nation, the people, the cause. Napoleon mastered this language. He held plebiscites for each major change, becoming consul for life, then later, Emperor of the French in 1804. These votes were hardly free, but they gave the appearance of consent. Meanwhile, across Europe, the republics that France had installed began to morph. In Italy, the Cisalpine Republic became the Italian Republic, with Napoleon as its president. It would later become the Kingdom of Italy, with Napoleon as king. The Helvetic Republic collapsed into chaos and civil strife. Eventually, it was reorganized under French influence. The Batavian Republic struggled with internal divisions and was eventually rebranded as the Kingdom of Holland, with Napoleon's brother Louis on the throne. Thus, France's satellite republics gradually evolved into monarchies in all but name, often ruled by members of Napoleon's family. The revolutionary language remained: constitutions, citizens, and codes. But the guiding principle had shifted from fraternity and equality to order and stability. Still, not all of the revolution's ideals were lost. The Napoleonic Code, which Napoleon introduced in 1804, carried forward many revolutionary legal reforms. It abolished feudal privileges, standardized property laws, and emphasized secular civil authority. Wherever the French armies went from the Rhine to the Vistula, the code followed. It dismantled serfdom in parts of Eastern Europe, restructured legal systems in Germany, and redefined inheritance law in Italy. In this sense, the revolution's impact endured not through politics, but through bureaucracy. Tax offices were established. Civil registries recorded births and marriages. Roads were built to enable communication and commerce. Education was reorganized into lycées and academies. These systems were dull, methodical, and deeply transformative. While the ideals of 1789 may have faded, the institutions created in their name shaped Europe for generations. And what of the monarchs? They watched, alarmed and intrigued. Some adopted revolutionary administrative techniques without embracing the ideology. In Prussia, for example, military and educational reforms mirrored French models. In Austria, bureaucratic rationalism took hold. Even Russia began to modernize aspects of its army and infrastructure, wary of being left behind. But opposition persisted. Britain remained France's staunchest enemy, resisting both revolutionary ideas and Napoleon's expansion. The British crown had no intention of tolerating a Europe united under French control, no matter how enlightened it appeared. In Spain and Portugal, resistance took a more violent turn. Guerrilla warfare against French occupation, especially during the Peninsular War, combined local rage with royalist and religious fervor. In many ways, this resistance revealed the limits of revolution by occupation. While French reforms promised modernity, they often ignored local culture, language, and religion. In some regions, the dismantling of the old order was welcomed. In others, it was met with resentment, rebellion, and bloodshed. By 1810, the Napoleonic Empire stretched from the Atlantic to the borders of Russia. The revolution, it seemed, had succeeded in reshaping the continent. Yet beneath the surface, cracks were widening. The more Napoleon centralized power, the more he contradicted the very ideals that had elevated him. He crowned himself emperor. He appointed family members to thrones. He censored the press, crushed dissent, and waged endless war. What had begun as a revolution for liberty was now an empire built on conscription and conquest. And yet, even when the empire would eventually collapse, as all empires do, the changes unleashed by the revolution would not vanish. The feudal order was gone. The idea of the nation-state had taken root. The belief that governments should answer to the people, however imperfectly, had entered the political bloodstream of Europe. After Napoleon's fall in 1815, the Congress of Vienna would attempt to restore the old monarchies and redraw the map. But it could not unmake the past. The revolution had shown what was possible and what could be demanded. The people of Europe had seen kings fall. They had experienced republican law, secular institutions, and the strange power of voting, even if manipulated. The flame could not be extinguished. In the decades that followed, Europe would witness revolutions in 1830, 1848, and beyond, each echoing the call of 1789. So what, then, was the true legacy of the French Revolution across Europe? Was it the bloody fall of monarchs, or the bureaucratic rise of modern states? Was it Napoleon's crown, or the code he left behind? Or was it something subtler, a shift in what people expected of those who ruled them, and what they believed they deserved. Story 3. Napoleon's military reforms and the art of boring logistics. When you picture Napoleon Bonaparte, what comes to mind? Perhaps it's the iconic image. One hand tucked into a uniform, astride a white horse, wind-blown coat trailing behind him, gazing across a battlefield like a man who sees all. Or maybe it's the epic battles Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram, where entire empires seem to rise and fall in a single afternoon. But what truly made Napoleon's military machine so formidable had little to do with inspiration or charisma. His genius lay not only in tactics, but in administration, the ability to mobilize, supply, and direct hundreds of thousands of men across vast distances with startling efficiency. It was not glory that fed the empire. It was paperwork, the legacy of chaos, a military in disrepair. At the start of the French Revolution, the French army was not a unified force. It was a fractured system of royal regiments, mercenaries, and volunteers, led largely by aristocrats and plagued with outdated logistics. Officers purchased commissions. Supplies were inconsistent. Soldiers were often unpaid, poorly trained, and badly fed. The revolution dissolved much of the old command structure, but did not immediately replace it with something better. For a time, the army operated through improvisation and sheer revolutionary zeal. But enthusiasm could only carry so far. Without boots, bread, or bullets, ideology alone would not win wars. Enter Napoleon, who brought with him an understanding that warfare, like society, needed a new system, one driven by logic, order, and above all, centralization. Corps d'armée, divide and conquer efficiently. One of Napoleon's most enduring innovations was the corps system, introduced around 1800 and perfected during his later campaigns. Rather than organizing his army into one massive, sluggish force, Napoleon divided it into self-contained corps, each comprising infantry, cavalry, artillery, engineers, and supply units. These corps could move independently, forage locally, and support one another when needed. It was like creating smaller, mobile armies within a larger whole. Each corps was typically commanded by a trusted marshal or general, and could operate days ahead or behind the main body, converging on key targets when conditions were right. This offered flexibility, speed, and the ability to deceive the enemy about where the main attack would fall. But this system only worked if logistics were flawless. The invisible battle, supplies and movement. Consider for a moment the daily needs of a corps of 20,000 men. They required tens of thousands of pounds of bread, meat, and grain, water or wine in clean, portable casks, horses to pull carts and caissons, wagons to carry ammunition, spare uniforms, boots, tents, medical supplies, blacksmith tools, engineering equipment, portable forges, field ovens, and mobile bakeries. Without a steady stream of these supplies, armies would starve, break down, or mutiny. Napoleon understood this better than any of his contemporaries. He employed quartermasters, engineers, and intendants whose sole job was to map roads, calculate marching routes, estimate forage availability, and plan where bridges might need repair. He revived and expanded the use of military bakeries, often building them in advance of the army's arrival. His officers conducted pre-campaign surveys of foreign terrain, gathering information on food sources, river crossings, and usable roads. A cavalry charge may have lasted minutes, but the logistical effort to position that cavalry took weeks. Napoleon once remarked, "An army marches on its stomach." But what he didn't say, though he practiced it daily, was that it also marches on lists, ledgers, and ledgers of lists. Speed and the iron rule of timetables. What made Napoleon's campaigns so difficult to predict was his speed. He often moved his forces faster than enemies could react, not by pushing soldiers beyond human limits, but by anticipating what they'd need and delivering it just in time. He reduced the reliance on slow-moving supply trains by encouraging local requisitioning, also known as living off the land. This meant his troops could move lighter and faster, though it often came at the expense of the local population. But even this had to be regulated. Officers kept forage logs, ration reports, and delivery receipts. Military police units were deployed to prevent looting and maintain discipline. Failure to adhere to these controls wasn't just frowned upon, it was punished, sometimes severely. The army was, in many ways, a mobile bureaucracy. Orders came down through printed bulletins. Maps were annotated, duplicated, and distributed. Marshals corresponded constantly, and Napoleon himself issued dozens of directives daily, even from the battlefield, often late into the night. His staff, known as the Maison Militaire, included secretaries, topographers, archivists, and aides-de-camp. Together, they maintained an internal rhythm that allowed the emperor to command not just battles, but the entire choreography of war. Training for coordination, not bravery. Napoleon's soldiers were not expected to win by sheer valor. They were expected to know where to be, when to be there, and what formation to stand in. Drill manuals were standardized. Regiments used uniform weaponry for easier resupply. Units trained in column, line, and square formations until muscle memory took over. The seemingly dull repetition of drills allowed for flexibility, and combat units could shift formation mid-battle, responding to terrain or enemy maneuvers with calm precision. It wasn't romantic, but it worked. This focus on predictability and precision extended to the artillery corps, where Napoleon had cut his teeth. Artillery teams were trained to calculate distance, wind, and elevation with ruthless efficiency. Guns were standardized. Caissons were designed for faster loading and unloading. Even the placement of cannonballs on the battlefield was optimized for time saving. Napoleon's eye for detail. Though he commanded massive armies, Napoleon remained deeply involved in minutiae. He would interrogate officers about shoe sizes, food portions, and the saddle sores on horses. He read medical reports. He asked about latrines and trench drainage. He wanted to know if soldiers had tents or whether they were sleeping under carts. At one point during the 1805 campaign, he learned that a unit lacked sufficient powder due to a misplaced delivery. Rather than assign blame, he rerouted the convoy by personal order and sent a note to the regiment apologizing for the delay. This obsessive attention to detail wasn't born from micromanagement for its own sake, it was strategic. Napoleon believed that a well-supplied, well-informed army could act faster, hold longer, and fight harder. And time, in Napoleon's mind, was the most precious resource of all. As the emperor continued to expand his campaigns into Central and Eastern Europe, his logistical systems would be tested like never before. The terrain would grow harsher, the distances longer, and the weather more punishing. Could the carefully planned, tightly coordinated machine of war still function in unfamiliar and hostile lands? And as Napoleon pushed deeper into the continent, where did the boundary lie between brilliant military innovation and the beginning of overreach? It is tempting to think of war as a matter of bold charges and brilliant maneuvers, of generals moving pieces on a chessboard of glory. But for Napoleon, the true battlefield was often the road, the warehouse, and the accounting table. In the early years of his campaigns, Napoleon's efficient logistics gave him a decisive advantage over the lumbering armies of Austria and Prussia. But as his ambitions grew, so did the complexity of the systems required to support them. From the bridges built by military engineers in the dead of night, to the countless requisition forms filed by anonymous clerks, war became a test not only of strategy, but of infrastructure. Let's look now at how the empire's logistics evolved from well-oiled to overburdened, and how, in that evolution, we begin to understand the fragile backbone of Napoleon's war machine. The gridded empire, infrastructure as a weapon. At the height of Napoleon's power, roughly between 1805 and 1812, the French Empire controlled most of continental Europe, directly or through vassal states. The map had changed, but maps on paper meant little if men and materiel could not move freely across the landscape. Thus began the reorganization of Europe's infrastructure. Napoleon ordered the construction and repair of roads, bridges, and canals. Though often remembered for battles, he left behind more miles of paved roads than any French monarch before him. In annexed regions, local engineers were conscripted into service. In conquered cities, existing roads were widened, way stations erected, and depots established. Each military district had warehouses stocked with flour, salt, shoes, and cartridges. Officers had precise maps that recorded the storage levels of each depot. Scribes updated inventories weekly. No major campaign was launched without careful calculation of what could be drawn from where. And yet, for all his innovations, Napoleon's empire was not self-sufficient. He relied heavily on requisitions, forced contributions from allied or conquered regions. Armies were instructed to live off the land, not as raiders, but in a structured, bureaucratic manner. Local administrators were given quotas, so many bushels of grain, so many head of cattle. Failure to comply could mean military occupation or worse. To some, this resembled plunder wrapped in paperwork, but it allowed the army to move quickly, with fewer wagons, and to wage war with limited French taxation. The intendants, empire's forgotten quartermasters. Behind every campaign was an army of intendant civil administrators charged with managing local logistics, requisitions, and troop movements. They were not generals or marshals. Many were never seen by the public, but they kept the gears turning. A typical intendant oversaw food distribution, ensured the safe transport of munitions, managed correspondence between corps, and updated Napoleon's central command with daily or weekly reports. They acted as middlemen between military command and civilian populations, tasked with preventing abuses and maintaining order, though success varied wildly by region. Napoleon expected them to be invisible but omnipresent. He rarely tolerated incompetence in this realm. His letters to them, still preserved, are filled with sharp reprimands. Where is the wine shipment from Mainz? Why has the bridge at Wurzburg not been repaired? I am told the mules are not shod. Correct this before next week. Without these logistics bureaucrats, the army would grind to a halt. Feeding the beast, the commissariat, and the soldiers' loaf. Let us consider the humble loaf of bread, or more precisely, the pain de munition, the standard army ration. Feeding Napoleon's Grande Armée, which at its peak numbered more than 600,000 men, required industrial-scale planning. Each man required approximately 1.5 pounds of bread daily. That meant nearly 1 million pounds of flour needed daily. Thousands of field ovens, maintained by baker units. A constant supply of wood for fuel. Wagons and carts for flour transport, kept dry and vermin-free. The commissariat managed this complex ballet. They coordinated with local mills, calculated projected usage, and anticipated delays. It was not uncommon for armies to run weeks ahead of their supply chains, especially during rapid advances, which made the commissaries' ability to forecast needs almost prophetic. The quality of the bread wasn't good, often stale or mixed with sawdust, but it was dependable. And for Napoleon, dependability beat luxury every time. Meat, on the other hand, was a luxury. When available, salted pork or dried fish supplemented the diet. In the field, soldiers often foraged. But here, too, regulations applied. Foraging had to be logged, distributed, and taxed, at least in theory. Munitions and mobility, the art of being armed. Napoleon's artillery was famously effective, in part due to its uniformity. Unlike other armies, which still used a mix of calibers and styles, Napoleon standardized his cannons mostly using 4, 8, and 12-pounders. This made it far easier to produce cannonballs in volume, train crews uniformly, maintain and repair parts quickly, store ammunition without confusion. Each piece of artillery required a team of gunners, horses, and a caisson, a two-wheeled cart for carrying ammunition. The caissons were packed in precise order to allow the gunners to reload faster in battle. Every detail, from the grease used on the wheels to the weight of the powder bags, was standardized. And when marching, the artillery had a strict sequence. Napoleon believed that timely artillery support could turn battles, so his road maps prioritized speed and placement. Bridges were evaluated for their weight limits. River crossings were reinforced in advance. Engineers were expected to anticipate every obstacle. War again was logistics. The road to strain, bureaucracy at its limits. While this system was extraordinary in its precision, it had limits. As Napoleon expanded eastward into Prussia, Poland, and eventually Russia, the terrain and distances overwhelmed even the best planning. Roads became impassable in the rainy season. Supply lines grew dangerously long. Requisitioning from unwilling populations led to uprisings and guerrilla warfare. In Spain, entire convoys vanished in ambushes. In Poland, roads disappeared into muddy wastelands. Communication lagged. Orders took days to arrive, and the army, dependent on its rhythm, began to falter. The sheer scale of warfare had grown too large for even the most elegant system. Napoleon did not adjust easily. He continued to rely on the same structures that had worked in the Italian and German campaigns. But in the vast, underdeveloped landscapes of Eastern Europe, the system's weaknesses became painfully clear. The supply depots were too far apart. The local economies were too poor to support foraging. Horses died from lack of fodder. Soldiers starved. Logistics, once the secret to Napoleon's victories, became a growing liability. Which raises the question: how far can a well-oiled machine be pushed before the gears begin to crack? And when it does crack, when roads vanish and reports go missing, what happens to a military system that depends on perfect control? By 1812, the Grande Armée was no longer the agile, tightly coordinated force that had once swept through Europe with near mathematical precision. It had grown enormous, an empire-sized institution, multilingual and multicultural, burdened by bureaucracy, strained supply lines, and the sheer geography of Napoleon's ambitions. Napoleon's most daring campaign, the invasion of Russia, was meant to be swift. Instead, it became the ultimate test of logistics and the clearest example of how even the most rational military system can crumble under pressure. The Russian campaign, a march too far. In the spring of 1812, Napoleon assembled what was then the largest military force Europe had ever seen. Over 600,000 men, drawn from every corner of his empire: French, Poles, Italians, Germans, Dutch, even Spaniards. The campaign's goal was to compel Tsar Alexander I to enforce the continental system, the economic blockade Napoleon had imposed to isolate Britain. But Russia was vast and empty in a way that no map could convey. Roads were poor, towns sparse, and the supply system built for dense European terrain was immediately overwhelmed. Napoleon's previous campaigns had relied on speed and local requisitioning, with depots pre-stocked and villages used as supply nodes. But in Russia, there were few roads, and they turned to mud or dust with the seasons. The villages were often burned ahead of the army's advance, scorched earth. The Russian army kept retreating deeper and deeper, refusing open battle. This denied Napoleon the opportunity for a quick victory, and worse, it forced his army to extend its own supply lines over hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. Depots could not keep up. Food ran out, horses died by the thousands, wagons broke, Men marched on empty stomachs, foraging through desolate lands already stripped of resources. Disease spread in the ranks. Typhus and dysentery claimed more lives than enemy gunfire. The famed military bakery system. It simply couldn't function. Ovens couldn't be built in time. Grain couldn't reach them. In many cases, soldiers ate raw grain or leather. Morale disintegrated. Desertion climbed. Moscow and the illusion of victory. When Napoleon finally reached Moscow in September 1812, it was not the triumph he had envisioned. The city had been abandoned, and shortly after, it began to burn set ablaze by Russian patriots. Napoleon waited for a surrender that never came. With winter approaching and no sign of Tsar Alexander, the emperor realized the truth. The campaign was unsustainable. The decision to retreat from Moscow marked the unraveling of the Grand Armée's logistical web. The path home was littered with corpses, abandoned wagons, and frozen men. Horses pulled sledges instead of cannons. Soldiers fought one another for crusts of bread. Crossing the Berezina River in late November became a desperate and chaotic affair. Bridges collapsed. Thousands drowned or were cut down by pursuing Russian forces. Only a fraction of the original army returned. Estimates suggest fewer than 100,000 survived. It was not battlefield tactics that doomed them. It was supply. Lessons unlearned. Spain, Germany, and the endless front. Even before the Russian disaster, Napoleon had been bleeding resources in Spain. The Peninsular War 1808–1814 had proven a logistical nightmare from the start. The roads were mountainous. The population was hostile. Guerrilla fighters ambushed convoys, disrupted communications, and drained French manpower. Here, the neat bureaucratic systems Napoleon had devised were nearly impossible to enforce. Local supply couldn't be controlled. Garrisons required constant reinforcements. Victory became unsustainable, no matter how many towns were captured. Back in Central Europe, Napoleon's enemies had learned from him. The Prussian and Austrian armies began to mimic the corps system, streamline logistics, and promote officers by merit. They established military academies and centralized command structures. What had once been Napoleon's advantage was now standard practice across Europe. And as his enemies modernized, Napoleon stagnated. He remained brilliant on the battlefield. His tactical instincts never truly failed him. But he continued to assume his old systems would function indefinitely, even as the political, geographical, and human realities shifted beneath his feet. His supply network was designed for short, decisive campaigns, not years-long occupations. His conscription systems, once efficient, became resented. His armies, once unified by victory and loot, were now fractured, stretched, and hungry. Collapse of the machine. By 1813–1814, France was under pressure from all sides. The Sixth Coalition, Britain, Austria, Prussia, Russia, and others, was closing in. Napoleon tried to rally new armies, but the conscripts were green. Horses were scarce. Gunpowder stocks ran low. In the past, Napoleon had been able to improvise around problems because his systems were flexible, scalable, and run by competent subordinates. But now the bureaucracy buckled under weight. Errors went uncorrected. Orders arrived late. Messages were intercepted. The Battle of Leipzig in 1813, sometimes called the Battle of the Nations, involved over 600,000 troops. It was Napoleon's largest engagement and a catastrophic loss. His carefully coordinated multi-corps army was now mismatched against equally professional, better rested, and better supplied enemies. In 1814, as the Allies invaded France itself, Napoleon found himself cut off from his own machinery. His marshals hesitated. His supply routes were in chaos. His reserves were exhausted. He abdicated in April 1814. The enduring bureaucratic legacy. It would be easy to say Napoleon lost because of hubris or geography or even fate, but in truth, it was a failure of the very system he had built. Logistics, once his greatest strength, had become brittle. Bureaucracy, once his advantage, was overloaded. Coordination, once flawless, had become too complex to maintain. And yet, what he left behind reshaped European military thought. Even his enemies began to maintain standing supply departments, create regional depots, and train officers in the art of administration, not just battle. The idea that war was won in spreadsheets as much as in trenches, that idea came from Napoleon. Final reflection. For all the glory attributed to Napoleon's battles, it is in the paper trails, road surveys, and menu rations that we find his truest mark on military history. He made war an institutional process, governed not by aristocratic whim, but by planned efficiency. He demonstrated that with the right structure, a nation could project power far beyond its borders. But he also showed that no system is infinite. Every empire, no matter how rational, has its limits, and sometimes those limits appear not on the battlefield, but in an unopened supply crate, missing shoes, or a starving horse on a frozen Russian road. Story 4. The Siege of Toulon, a young commander's first victory. In the autumn of 1793, the port city of Toulon, on the southern coast of France, found itself at the center of a quietly pivotal moment in European history. Not because of a major battle, nor because of a treaty, but because of a young, obscure artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte, whose skill in logistics, terrain, and siegecraft would forever alter his course and the course of France. The event is known as the Siege of Toulon, and while the name suggests a grand and dramatic affair, the truth is more understated. It was a messy, drawn-out, and logistically taxing episode in the French Revolutionary Wars, steeped in political confusion, slow artillery movements, and poor coordination. In other words, it was exactly the sort of battlefield that Napoleon would thrive in. Context: a city caught between monarchs and revolution. Toulon, France's principal naval base on the Mediterranean, had long been a strategic gem. Its deep harbor housed much of the French fleet, and its location offered easy access to Italy, Spain, and North Africa. But in 1793, France was a nation at war with itself and with the rest of Europe. The French Revolution had entered its more radical phase. King Louis XVI had been executed in January. The Committee of Public Safety under Maximilien Robespierre now ruled with increasing intensity. Fear of counter-revolution gripped the country. Meanwhile, France was fighting multiple external enemies, including Britain, Austria, Spain, and the Kingdom of Sardinia. Within France, royalist uprisings had broken out in various cities. Toulon, largely sympathetic to the monarchy and weary of revolutionary excesses, chose a dangerous path. It surrendered itself to a coalition of British and Spanish forces, inviting them to occupy the city and its strategic port. This decision was not merely symbolic. It handed over one of France's largest naval arsenals and most of its ships to the enemy. The revolutionary government could not ignore such a betrayal. Enter Napoleon Bonaparte. At this point, Napoleon Bonaparte was an unknown. A 24-year-old captain of artillery, he had recently returned from Corsica after falling out with local political leaders. He was, in many ways, politically homeless, without powerful allies, without money, and without any command of significance. But he had two things: technical expertise and relentless initiative. When he arrived at the siege, he found chaos. The revolutionary army besieging Toulon was disorganized, poorly led, and lacked a coherent strategy. Multiple generals argued. The Committee of Public Safety sent representatives to oversee operations, and their meddling only added to the confusion. The artillery, the very branch Napoleon belonged to, was undersupplied and improperly deployed. Cannons were scattered and lacked coordination. The terrain had not been properly mapped. And worst of all, the commanding officers had no clear plan for how to dislodge the British and Spanish from the fortified city. Napoleon quickly assessed the situation and submitted a detailed proposal, a systematic plan to take control of the heights overlooking the port, the forts of Quill and Balaguer. These positions, if captured, would allow French artillery to fire directly on the harbor, forcing the British fleet to retreat. It was not a glamorous plan. It relied on terrain analysis, accurate placement of guns, and painstaking logistics, but it was brilliant in its simplicity. At first, Napoleon's ideas were dismissed. He was young, Corsican, and a junior officer, but he persisted, working around the indecisiveness of his superiors. He made alliances with local engineers, reorganized artillery units himself, and even oversaw the construction of new roads and platforms to move and position cannons on the rocky heights. Eventually, his competence became undeniable. When command changed hands again, the new general, Jacques Dugommier, recognized the value in Napoleon's plan. Under Dugommir's leadership, Bonaparte was finally given authority over the artillery, and the siege began to change course. The details: cannons, carts, and coordination. The terrain around Toulon is steep and uneven. To move heavy cannon into position required more than manpower, it required carpentry, engineering, and patience. Napoleon supervised the construction of gun platforms, ramparts, and batteries. He personally scouted routes, walked the lines, and measured distances. His attention to detail was obsessive. He calculated trajectories, ensured adequate supplies of powder and shot, and kept meticulous records of each battery's activity. One of the key positions he established was known as Battery of the Men Without Fear, La Batterie des Hommes Sans Peur, a cluster of guns positioned to harass the enemy forts from multiple angles. These were not static placements, they evolved based on the terrain and enemy response. The battle was as much an engineering challenge as a military one. Meanwhile, the British and Spanish, confident in their naval superiority, remained unaware of the quiet buildup on the heights above the harbor. By December, Napoleon was ready. The assault and its aftermath. On the night of December 17, 1793, French forces launched a coordinated assault on the key forts guarding the harbor. Napoleon's artillery softened the defenses for days beforehand, pounding the enemy relentlessly. When the assault came, it was brutal but successful. The capture of Fort Quill was the turning point. From this position, French guns could now fire directly into Toulon's harbor, endangering the British fleet. Realizing the city was no longer defensible, the British and Spanish evacuated, but not before they destroyed large sections of the port and set fire to as many French ships as possible. The loss was considerable, but the symbolic victory for the revolutionary government was greater. Toulon had been reclaimed. The royalist insurgency there was broken, and most importantly, a new military figure had emerged. Napoleon Bonaparte, still only a captain at the start of the siege, was promoted to brigadier general just days after the victory. He was 24 years old. A reputation forged in fire and paperwork. What set Napoleon apart in Toulon wasn't dramatic heroism. It was his ability to see the battlefield as a logistical and mathematical puzzle. He outthought his enemies, not just outfought them. He understood that cannon placement and supply coordination could achieve what brute force could not. The siege of Toulon became a quiet turning point in the Revolutionary Wars, and for Napoleon, it became the first step on a ladder that would lead to empire. But what lessons did he draw from this victory? Would his obsession with artillery and logistics continue to define his approach? And could the same methods that won a siege on the southern coast of France scaled to the vast battlefields of Europe. The recapture of Toulon in December 1793 did more than restore a vital naval port to the French Republic. It created a ripple that would carry a young artillery officer from the obscurity of provincial postings to the very summit of political and military power. But that journey was not instant, nor was it solely dependent on battlefield merit. Toulon was not only a military triumph. It was a case study in how Napoleon Bonaparte leveraged technical skill, political acumen, and sheer bureaucratic persistence to engineer his rise through networks of power, through letters and memoranda, and through his uncanny ability to present himself as indispensable. Napoleon the self-promoter, seizing the moment. In the days following the victory at Toulon, Napoleon's reports to Paris were sharply written, precise, and self-promotional but never boastful. He emphasized results, not heroics. He detailed how the positions had been taken, where the artillery had been placed, how ammunition had been calculated to minimize waste. Even in triumph, his focus was on efficiency. But those who read the reports understood what they were seeing: a technocratic savant, a man who not only fought but thought and documented. And Paris noticed. The revolutionary government was in dire need of competence. France was still battling enemies on multiple fronts, its armies were poorly led, and loyalty was always in question. The Jacobins in power, led by Robespierre, feared counter-revolution and sought to surround themselves with people who got results and could be trusted ideologically. Napoleon, a self-identified Jacobin during this period, fit the mold. More importantly, he had just saved Toulon, a port too important to be lost. In recognition of this, he was promoted to brigadier general, an extraordinary leap considering he had been only a captain weeks earlier. At 24, he was now one of the youngest generals in the army. A network of patrons, the role of Salisty and Robespierre. While Napoleon's skill was undeniable, his ascent also owed much to the political patrons he cultivated, most notably Antoine Christophe Salisty, a fellow Corsican and deputy of the convention. Salisty had long taken an interest in Napoleon's career, perhaps out of regional loyalty or shared revolutionary ideals. He spoke highly of Napoleon in his dispatches, smoothing his path through the often hostile bureaucracy of the French military. Equally critical was Napoleon's alignment with the Jacobins. He attended their meetings, expressed support for Robespierre's policies, and gave the impression of revolutionary zeal. This was not mere flattery, it was strategic. Napoleon recognized that the revolution was not just about ideas, but about aligning oneself with power. During 1794, this alignment paid off. Napoleon was appointed commander of artillery for the Army of Italy, a significant post given the importance of the Southern Front. He was now responsible for organizing the artillery of a major fighting force, a role that again emphasized his strengths in logistics and organization. And yet, the danger of political proximity in revolutionary France was always lurking. Thermidor and the fall from favor. On 9 Thermidor year II, July 27, 1794, Robespierre fell from power, executed along with his closest allies. The Thermidorian reaction that followed purged Jacobin loyalists from the army and administration. Those seen as too close to the former regime suddenly found themselves under suspicion or worse. Napoleon, once so close to Jacobin circles, was suddenly vulnerable. He was arrested briefly, and his promotion and recent activities were investigated. His letters and service records were scrutinized. He had to explain how a young Corsican artilleryman had managed to rise so quickly through the ranks of a faction now out of favor. It's worth noting that Napoleon survived not through charm or ideology, but again through pragmatic paperwork. His performance at Toulon and subsequent administrative reforms in the Army of Italy were too effective to ignore. He had not been ideological in his methods, he had simply made things work. Even so, he was sidelined for a time. His career entered a lull. He was offered minor commands such as an ill-fated mission to suppress a rebellion in the Vendée and refused them, considering them beneath his station. This brief act of defiance further strained his standing, and he found himself without a command for much of 1795. Paris in waiting, a general in the shadows. During his months without a post, Napoleon remained in Paris, living in modest circumstances, observing and networking. He spent time with political moderates, reformists, and those rebuilding France's administrative structures. He read constantly, wrote political essays, and watched as the new government, the Directory, struggled to maintain control. Paris was a city between upheavals. The revolution's fire had dimmed but not extinguished. Veterans, politicians, ex-Jacobins, and new Republicans all jostled for position. The country needed stability, but no one could deliver it. And then came 13 Vendémiaire, October 5, 1795. The grape shot in the Republic. On that day, a royalist uprising threatened the Directory. Thousands of insurgents, monarchists, disaffected citizens, and anti-republican forces marched on the Tuileries Palace in Paris, hoping to overthrow the government. The Directory needed someone capable, decisive, and preferably ruthless to defend the regime. Paul Barras, one of the Directory's leading figures and an acquaintance of Napoleon, turned to the young general. Bonaparte, idle for months but always ready, accepted the assignment without hesitation. What followed was not a pitched battle. It was an exercise in artillery placement. Napoleon calmly deployed 40 cannons at key intersections throughout the city. When the insurgents advanced, he ordered grape-shot small balls of metal fired from cannons into the ranks of the attackers. The effect was devastating. The rebellion was broken in less than an hour. It became known as the whiff of grape shot, a phrase that would echo through history. The Republic had been saved not by a speech or a treaty, but by coordinated firepower, placed with lethal precision. The Directory was grateful. Napoleon, once again, had shown that he was a man who could be trusted with crisis. After Toulon, the beginning of a pattern. The siege of Toulon and its aftermath established patterns that would define Napoleon's rise. Identify structural weakness and move to fill the vacuum with decisive, technical solutions. Forge political alliances that offer protection, but never become too dependent on any single faction. Promote results over rhetoric. Let victory speak louder than ideology. Use military success as a springboard into political influence, carefully accumulating power in the background. Each of these traits would return again and again as Napoleon moved from general to consul, and ultimately to emperor. But in late 1795, he was still just a rising officer in the new republic, preparing for his next command, one that would take him across the Alps and into legend. So then, having risen through siegecraft, revolution, and political purges, the question remained: what would Napoleon do when finally given an army of his own to lead not in defense, but in conquest? By early 1796, Napoleon Bonaparte had already demonstrated the traits that would define his career: brilliance in planning, mastery of terrain, and the rare ability to seize political opportunity amid confusion. But it was still unclear whether he was a clever technician, a fortunate survivor of factional chaos, or something far more dangerous, a man destined to rewire Europe's balance of power. Toulon had elevated him, the 13 Vendémiaire had legitimized him, and now he stood on the brink of something greater. The Italian campaign, his first independent command, would soon consume him. But before that leap, the aftermath of Toulon and the systems and instincts it sharpened deserve reflection. This final section will examine the lasting lessons of Toulon, not only for Napoleon, but for military history at large. Because while the siege is often footnoted as his first victory, It was much more than a battlefield, it was a training ground for imperial methods. Lessons in artillery and engineering. The craft becomes doctrine. What had Napoleon learned at Toulon? Artillery is decisive when placed correctly. This may seem obvious now, but at the time, many generals still viewed artillery as a secondary support arm. Napoleon's insistence on its centrality to operations, its ability to shape battles, not just end them, was revolutionary. Engineering precedes strategy. The placement of gun batteries, the construction of earthworks, the use of roads and bridges, these were not post-battle considerations. They were the battle. At Toulon, Napoleon had treated carpenters, sappers, and smiths with the same attention as cavalry commanders. These ideas were soon codified into French military doctrine. The artillery school at Chalons, from which Napoleon had graduated, saw a resurgence in prestige. Young officers were now encouraged to study mathematics, logistics, and engineering, not just courage and swordplay. And across Europe, military thinkers took note. Siegecraft had evolved. Static sieges were no longer exercises in attrition, they could be dynamic, mobile, and short, if executed with insight. Human resources and morale. The rise of the soldier technocrat. Toulon also taught Napoleon a great deal about human capital. He recognized that victory depended not just on generals, but on sergeants, scribes, teamsters, and bakers. He paid attention to their needs and used the siege as a model for how to build effective, layered leadership. He rewarded men who got things done, regardless of their political alignment, though always carefully watching their loyalties. He despised inefficiency and often bypassed slow-moving bureaucrats to send orders directly to foremen and lieutenants. This habit would grow stronger with time, forming the backbone of the Napoleonic command structure, a tight, centralized system where competent officers were promoted swiftly and expected to carry out orders with precision. This was meritocracy in the revolutionary sense, but also a form of military technocracy. The men who rose with Napoleon after Toulon, Berthier, Junot, Marmont shared not only battlefield experience but administrative acumen. They could manage depots as easily as formations. The power of documentation, writing history while it happens. Another subtle but vital legacy of Toulon was Napoleon's use of written reports as both communication and self-marketing. While other officers submitted bland summaries, Napoleon's dispatches were vivid, analytical, and laced with subtle self-promotion. He never exaggerated, he simply let his efficiency speak through numbers, measurements, and logistics. His bulletins became models of clarity. They reached Paris and were read aloud in salons, army councils, and even the convention itself. Over time, this shaped how military success was seen and remembered. Napoleon realized he could shape perception not by winning alone, but by documenting how he won in a language that politicians understood: order, planning, precision. This would later expand into something much larger, the propaganda machine of the Napoleonic era, but its origins can be traced to Toulon's post-battle reports. The siege as a metaphor, order emerging from confusion. In retrospect, the siege of Toulon was less about capturing a city and more about proving that order could be imposed upon chaos. It was France's first major military success after months of internal instability and battlefield losses. It showed that the Republic could produce not only ideology but competence. And Napoleon embodied that shift. Toulon was a mess: overlapping commands, poor supplies, political distrust. And yet from that confusion emerged a result that seemed, in retrospect, inevitable. Not because the enemy was weak, but because someone had finally understood the field not as terrain alone, but as a system. It was the same approach he would apply to Italy in 1796, and again in Austria, Prussia, and beyond. Not just war, but systems management under pressure. Foreshadowing empire, Toulon in microcosm. Though Napoleon was a Republican in 1793, Toulon revealed imperial instincts. He centralized decision-making, reduced the autonomy of his subordinates, and brought disparate parts of the army into alignment under a single plan. He was not yet an emperor, but his methods already leaned that way. And the political authorities noticed. Robespierre's successors would later admit that we may have created a general more dangerous than the enemy. They were not wrong. Toulon was a proving ground not only for siege warfare, but for the very governing style Napoleon would soon unleash on an entire continent. Compass final reflection. A career begins in the earthworks. Most historical narratives fast forward through Toulon to get to Napoleon's later glories: the bridges of Lodi, the battlefield of Austerlitz, the grand coronation in Notre Dame. But if you listen closely, you can hear the hum of empire beginning not in trumpets or cannon blasts, but in the squeak of a wagon axle, the hammering of gun platforms, and the scratching of quill on paper. In Toulon, we see Napoleon not yet as a conqueror but as a constructor, of trenches, of plans, of his own legacy. And as he left the smoking port behind him, now a brigadier general, newly connected to the political networks of Paris, one must wonder, was Napoleon already envisioning something more than command? Was the siege of Toulon just a tactical success, or the blueprint of how a republic could quietly be built into an empire? Story 5. The Italian Campaign: Mud, Maps, and Military Bureaucracy. In the spring of 1796, freshly promoted commander-in-chief of the Army of Italy, Napoleon Bonaparte took charge of a starving, threadbare army stationed in the ragged foothills of the French-Italian border. His soldiers lacked boots, food, and confidence. Their pay was months overdue. Their uniforms were mismatched, and their morale was worse. This was not an elite fighting force. It was a desperate collection of exhausted men at the end of their patience. Yet within a year, this same army would march triumphantly through Lodi, Milan, and Mantua, humbling the powerful Austrian Empire, redrawing borders, and reshaping Europe's political geography. The Italian campaign would become one of the most remarkable military efforts in modern history, and not because of glorious cavalry charges or dramatic speeches. No, what made the Italian campaign successful were things far more mundane: supply lines, marching orders, field surveys, and an obsessive attention to detail. This was war by bureaucracy, one fought and won with ledgers, logistics, and a mind tuned not just to battlefields, but to balance sheets and mountain passes. Taking command, an army in tatters. When Napoleon arrived to assume command of the Army of Italy, he was 26 years old. The appointment, which at first seemed like a consolation prize, the main action was expected in Germany, turned out to be a masterstroke. The army he inherited had barely moved in months. Supply lines were unreliable. Troops were often barefoot, surviving on meager rations or local plunder. They hadn't been paid regularly, and desertions were common. Officers had grown complacent or despondent. It was, by all accounts, an army waiting to collapse. Napoleon's first act wasn't to inspire with speeches. It was to organize. He reviewed inventory reports, met with quartermasters, and inspected supply wagons himself. He demanded accurate maps from the topographers, reorganized troop placements based on terrain rather than outdated orders, and issued a flurry of directives that signaled a new era of discipline. Then came the proclamations, carefully crafted messages to the troops, distributed widely and read aloud. You are poorly fed and almost naked. The Republic owes you much, but can give you nothing. I am leading you into the most fertile plains in the world. There you will find glory, honor, and riches. This was not romantic rhetoric, it was psychological logistics. Napoleon made the soldiers believe that their suffering had a purpose and a timeline. And critically, he paid them. How? He promised the Directory that the campaign would fund itself through requisitions, forced contributions, and careful plunder. If the army moved fast and struck hard, it would be fed by the conquered. A controversial strategy, yes, but one that bought immediate loyalty. The plan: divide and conquer with calculations. The strategic objective was simple: weaken Austria's influence in northern Italy and prevent it from attacking France from the south. Austria had two armies defending this region, one stationed in Piedmont, the other in Lombardy. Napoleon's plan was to separate and destroy them before they could unite. This required more than courage. It required precise timing, topographical awareness, and near-daily marching orders. Napoleon's team produced and updated field maps constantly. Scouts were sent ahead not only to observe enemy positions, but to survey road conditions, assess river crossings, and report on the availability of forage. Engineers traveled with each division, ready to build or repair bridges and fortifications. In short, this was not just an army on the move. It was a mobile bureaucratic apparatus. Napoleon personally wrote or dictated dozens of orders each day, covering everything from cannon placement to wine rationing. He tracked troop positioning down to the regiment, knew how many pack mules each corps had, and monitored powder stocks to avoid waste. What seemed like improvisation in the field was often the result of hours of careful night planning, poring over maps and reports by candlelight. The first battles: Arcola, Montagnat, and Lodi. The campaign began with a rapid strike through the Ligurian Alps, catching the Piedmontese forces by surprise. In just 2 weeks, Napoleon won a string of victories, culminating in the Battle of Montagnat. It was a logistical masterpiece. His army had marched through poor weather and difficult mountain passes to appear where the Austrians didn't expect them. The attack was coordinated across multiple fronts, each time to distract and divide the enemy. While not a large battle by historical standards, it was enough to shake confidence in the Austrian alliance. With Piedmont withdrawing from the war, Napoleon turned east toward Lombardy. At Lodi, a key crossing over the Adda River, Napoleon faced a well-defended bridge. Rather than attempt a dangerous frontal assault, he used artillery to fix the enemy's attention, then directed a coordinated infantry rush across the bridge, catching the Austrians in disarray. It became legendary. But for Napoleon, the true importance of Lodi was not the bridge, it was the lesson in momentum. Keep the army moving, keep the enemy guessing, and above all, never allow the enemy to consolidate. He wrote after Lodi, "From that moment, I no longer considered myself a mere general, but a man destined to change the fate of nations." Civil administration on the march. Conquest for Napoleon was never just military. In cities like Milan, Parma, and Modena, he moved quickly to install new republican governments, levy taxes, and seize military supplies. He requisitioned silver and gold from churches and palaces. But he also ordered that local laws be respected, that grain stores be regulated, and that public order be maintained. He set up postal services, censuses, and municipal offices. In the middle of a campaign, he was effectively governing new territories. His administration issued receipts for requisitions to give the impression of legal order. Artists and scientists were brought along to document and inventory cultural treasures, an early version of what would become the Napoleonic museum-building machine. Every move was calculated to turn conquest into control. Supply in the Po Valley, a case study in movement. The Po River Valley, though fertile, was treacherous for large-scale movement. Marshy areas limited where cannons could be transported. Weather often turned roads to muck. For most generals, this would mean caution. Napoleon doubled down on mobility. He created temporary depots, warehouses set up ahead of time and resupplied by barge and cart. He standardized marching orders, so that columns would not congest roads or exhaust local forage. Each division was given time slots for river crossings, and even bridge construction was scheduled to avoid delays. In the rare instances when supplies ran short, Napoleon redirected his campaign toward regions known to have more grain or fodder, turning logistics into strategy. Closing thought. The Italian campaign is often told through the lens of its military triumphs, but its true significance lies in the way Napoleon turned a disorganized, unfed army into a military administrative machine, one that could outmaneuver, out-administer, and outlast better-funded enemies. In truth, the victory began long before the cannons fired. It began in the quiet rooms where maps were unrolled, reports were reviewed, and pencil lines charted the movements of thousands. But as the victories mounted and cities fell, a more difficult question began to take shape. Could Napoleon maintain momentum, not just with bullets, but with bureaucracy when the enemy finally stopped retreating and chose to make a stand? Victory in the early phase of the Italian campaign had come with startling speed. Napoleon Bonaparte, now commanding a revitalized French force, had swept through the Piedmontese and Austrian defenses with precision, dismantling opposition in Montagnat, Dago, Lodi, and Milan. Each engagement revealed a commander who treated war as a series of moving parts: terrain, supply, timing, and pressure. But war is rarely one swift motion. It is a system that strains under its own success. And as the campaign turned toward Mantua, the cracks in Napoleon's system began to show, revealing both the strength and the fragility of warfare by bureaucratic momentum. Mantua, nestled in the marshlands of northern Italy, became the center of one of Napoleon's longest and most testing military operations. It was a siege, yes, but one that blurred the lines between logistics, diplomacy, and sheer human endurance. Mantua, why it mattered. To understand the next phase of the campaign, you must understand Mantua's strategic value. It was one of the fortress cities of the Austrian Empire in Italy, heavily fortified and garrisoned. It sat near key crossing points of the Mincio River, making it a natural defensive hub. Most critically, it acted as a gateway. So long as the Austrians held Mantua, they could launch counteroffensives into northern Italy and threaten Napoleon's supply lines and newly gained territory. If Napoleon wanted to secure Italy for France, Mantua had to fall. But sieges are not like field battles. They are slow, complex, and maddeningly dependent on logistics. This was the kind of warfare that would either prove the value of Napoleon's systemic methods or break them entirely. Siege begins, summer 1796. In June 1796, Napoleon began tightening a cordon around Mantua. The city was defended by roughly 12,000 Austrian troops, supplied by river barges and well-stocked depots. Taking it by storm was not an option. The marshes surrounding the city made a direct assault suicidal. Instead, Napoleon chose a siege by starvation, cutting off access roads and placing artillery to bombard the fortifications intermittently. But he lacked the heavy siege guns necessary for a rapid reduction. Those had to be brought in from farther west, via poor roads and weak bridges. And the weather would not cooperate. Rain turned paths into sludge, oxen teams bogged down, gun carriages broke under strain, horses died from lack of forage. Troops assigned to dig trenches developed illness from malaria and dysentery, endemic in the swampy region. Disease, not bullets, began to claim soldiers. To complicate matters, the Austrians, far from giving up, began organizing relief efforts. The four Austrian relief armies. Between July 1796 and February 1797, Austria launched 4 separate attempts to relieve the siege of Mantua. Each one became a campaign of its own, and each one tested the limits of Napoleon's planning, endurance, and improvisational skill. First attempt: the Wormser offensive, July 1796. General Dagobert von Wurmser, an experienced Austrian commander, led 50,000 troops toward Mantua to break the French blockade. Napoleon reacted quickly, abandoning the siege temporarily, and using the interior line strategy, marching his smaller force rapidly to engage isolated Austrian columns before they could unite. He defeated Wurmser at Castiglione, then drove the remnants back into Mantua, ironically adding thousands more mouths to feed within the city's walls. This was Napoleon's flexibility at its best. Logistics officers rerouted supply wagons mid-march, engineers rebuilt bridges overnight, and command staff coordinated complex troop movements in real time. His ability to temporarily break the siege, fight battles, and return to re-establish the blockade relied on trust in his systems. But the strain was growing. Second attempt the Tyrol maneuver, September 1796. Austria tried again. Wurmser led a new force through the Brenner Pass, planning to descend through the Tyrol and flank Napoleon from the north. It was bold and might have worked. But Napoleon predicted it. He moved his army through the mountain passes, executing rapid forced marches to engage Wurmser in the Adige Valley. The battles of Bassano and Caldiro followed sharp, mobile engagements won largely due to speed and concentrated firepower. But the logistics were punishing, troops were exhausted, supply lines were stretched across difficult terrain, food and powder grew scarce. Wurmser, defeated again, retreated into Mantua, further swelling its garrison and worsening its supply situation. Once more, Napoleon had used terrain and timing to outmaneuver a larger force, but at escalating logistical cost. Third and fourth attempts the grim winter campaign, late 1796, early 1797. As winter fell, the French army began to suffer. Napoleon's administrative structures were overextended, the roads froze, wagons could not move, food spoiled in depots, the men were cold, underfed, and often sick, ammunition had to be rationed. The Austrians, now under General Alvinczi, launched yet another relief attempt, this time with better coordination. At Arcole and Rivoli, Napoleon faced the most intense battles of the campaign. At Arcole, he famously seized a flag and tried to lead his men across a narrow causeway under fire, more myth than strategic necessity, but reflective of how close things were to breaking. Behind the scenes, the battle was not won with a flag, it was won with coordination. French artillery had been moved in secret through back channels. Engineers had reinforced river crossings. Troop schedules had been revised the night before the battle, with columns approaching from 3 directions. At Rivoli, he pulled off a masterclass in battlefield logistics, defending a central ridge with a force that shifted positions hourly, supplied by prepositioned ammunition caches and horse relays. These were victories not of brute strength, but of administrative choreography. The fall of Mantua, February 1797. Finally, after 8 months of siege and 4 relief attempts, Mantua surrendered. Over 18,000 Austrian soldiers laid down their arms. The fortress, long a symbol of Austrian dominance in Italy, was now in French hands. The siege had cost France tens of thousands of casualties, mostly from disease and exposure. It had drained manpower and supplies. It had required Napoleon to run 5 campaigns simultaneously: siege, field defense, pursuit, diplomacy, and governance. But it had also solidified his reputation as a general unlike any other. Administrative aftershocks, the Cisalpine Republic. With Mantua fallen and northern Italy under control, Napoleon turned once again to civil administration. He helped create the Cisalpine Republic, headquartered in Milan. This client state became a model of French-inspired governance. Feudal laws were abolished. Land reform commissions were established. A new currency and tax system was introduced. French bureaucrats oversaw military recruitment, postal service, and education. Even the calendar was changed, using the revolutionary French system complete with thermidor and brumaire. This was ideology through infrastructure. And yet, Napoleon remained pragmatic. He allowed local elites to keep power if they were cooperative. He courted church officials while simultaneously seizing church property. He wrote letters daily balancing military reports with memos on urban management, canal repair, and festival organization. This was total warfare of a new kind, not just conquest but total administrative control. Closing thought. The siege of Mantua was never simply about a fortress. It was about the durability of a new kind of military operation, one that fused firepower with infrastructure, inspiration with engineering. Napoleon's Italy campaign was not an improvisation. It was a long experiment in modern warfare, conducted across mountains, marshes, and municipal councils. But after all the marching, mapping, and managing, there remained one final frontier in the campaign. How would Napoleon use the momentum of Mantua to force peace with Austria without marching to Vienna itself? By the spring of 1797, Napoleon Bonaparte had done the improbable. His army of Italy, once dismissed as an underfed ragtag force in the shadows of Austria's military might, had systematically dismantled the Habsburg grip on northern Italy. Victory after victory, Montagnat, Lodi, Arcole, Rivoli had made Napoleon a legend among his troops and a subject of fascination across Europe. But Napoleon's end goal was never just military. The Italian campaign was also a prelude to politics, a testing ground for something much greater: how to rule not just soldiers, but societies. We explore the Treaty of Campo Formio, the end of the campaign, and how Napoleon used bureaucratic power, diplomatic maneuvering, and personal initiative to transition from general to geopolitical architect. Toward peace, the march beyond Mantua. With Mantua surrendered, most of northern Italy fell into French hands. But Napoleon didn't stop there. He moved northeast, pressing into Austrian-controlled territory, eventually threatening the very heartland of the Habsburg Empire. His advance wasn't haphazard. Even here, Napoleon employed his characteristic method: scout the terrain, establish depots, issue marching timetables, maintain tight communication between corps. This wasn't a man chasing glory, it was a man managing strategic pressure through precision. His army crossed into Styria and moved toward Vienna itself. Alarmed, the Austrian government sought negotiations. But rather than wait for the Directory in Paris to take the lead, Napoleon did something remarkable. He opened peace talks himself. Campo Formio, diplomacy as personal command. The resulting negotiation, the Treaty of Campo Formio, signed on October 17, 1797, was arguably more significant than any of Napoleon's battlefield victories. Hear why. It was negotiated almost entirely by Napoleon himself. It redrew the map of Europe. It established new client states and transferred entire regions of territory without consulting much of the French government. The treaty's key terms: Austria ceded Belgium to France. The left bank of the Rhine territories in Germany went to French control. Austria was compensated with the Venetian Republic, which Napoleon had just conquered and dissolved, ending over 1,000 years of Venetian independence. The Cisalpine Republic and Ligurian Republic were confirmed as French satellite states. This was not diplomacy in the traditional ceremonial sense. There were no grand congresses. Napoleon bypassed the established French foreign ministry, conducted direct talks, and treated the negotiation like a field campaign: tactical, swift, and outcome-oriented. He once again demonstrated that information, coordination, and initiative could outmatch traditional aristocratic procedure. Exporting the revolution, and the filing cabinet. The new client states in Italy were more than political buffer zones. They were laboratories. In each republic Cisalpine, Ligurian, Roman Napoleon and his administrators introduced uniform civil codes modeled on the French system, abolished aristocratic privileges and feudal duties, confiscated church lands, and created central tax offices, established departments like those in France for justice, police, education, and finance, introduced standard weights and measures, including the metric system. Each new state also had its own constitution drafted with assistance from French jurists. Napoleon ensured these constitutions were passed, distributed, and filed along with population counts, land registries, and civil appointment rosters. This was a paper empire governed not just with bayonets, but with bureaucracy. The other Italian campaign, culture and curation. As the armies moved, so did another force, the Commission des Sciences et des Arts, a group of scholars, engineers, and artists accompanying the military. Their task, inventory the cultural wealth of Italy. From Mantua to Milan to Venice, Napoleon's orders were clear. Identify paintings, sculptures, manuscripts, and scientific artifacts of historical value and transport them to France. Churches, palaces, and libraries were scoured. Artworks were tagged and shipped. Some were gifts from newly created republics. Others were taken outright as spoils. Canvases from Titian, Veronese, and Raphael made their way to Paris. Ancient manuscripts, globes, and architectural fragments followed. Napoleon wasn't merely looting, he was curating. These items were destined for the Louvre, reimagined as the Museum Central des Arts, a museum of Republican civilization. This campaign of cultural acquisition required, again, bureaucracy. Inventories were written in triplicate. Transport schedules were issued. Warehouses cataloged each item. Receipts were sent to Paris. It was not theft in haste, it was archival imperialism, conducted with quiet precision. The Directory grows nervous. Back in Paris, the ruling Directory had mixed feelings. Napoleon was undeniably successful. He had brought them peace, territory, and money. His conquests had funded the Republic's debts and stabilized its borders. His propaganda dispatches from Italy had turned him into a national hero. But he had also negotiated a major treaty without consulting Paris, created new governments in Italy, installed loyal administrators, amassed tremendous personal loyalty from his army. The Directory rightly began to worry that they had lost control of their most successful general. In response, they tried to redirect him to Egypt in 1798, but that's another story. For now, what matters is this. By the end of the Italian campaign, Napoleon had proven not only that he could win wars, but that he could build states, manage territories, and enforce order through administration, not chaos. Compass final reflection. The Italian campaign is often remembered as Napoleon's military coming of age, a tour de force of bold strategy and battlefield triumph. But beneath the muskets and medals was something quieter and far more durable. It was in quartermaster ledgers and supply maps, in requisition forms and municipal bylaws, in the formation of republics, not through idealism, but through drafting committees, councils, and fiscal systems. Napoleon didn't just conquer Italy, he reorganized it. And in doing so, he revealed a deeper lesson of the modern age. That power, once held by kings and nobles, could now be wielded by those who controlled the administrative machinery of the state. No wonder the old monarchies trembled. They had lost to a man who carried as many folders as he did flags. But now, with peace signed, borders redrawn, and the army resting, the question quietly began to echo in Paris. What do you do with a general who wins wars so efficiently that he no longer needs permission to end them? Story 6. The Treaty of Campo Formio redrawing borders with ink and ennui. On a quiet day in October 1797, far from any battlefield, a treaty was signed at an inn in the small village of Campo Formio, near Udine in northeastern Italy. No grand palace, no gilded halls, just a simple table, a quill, and two men with very different visions for Europe's future. One of those men was Napoleon Bonaparte, 28 years old, dressed plainly in a military coat. The other, Count Ludwig von Cobenzl, represented the vast and creaking Austrian Empire. Outside there were no soldiers. Inside there was no room for ceremony. And yet, in that modest setting, the map of Europe was about to be redrawn. The Treaty of Campo Formio marked the end of the War of the First Coalition and the conclusion of Napoleon's first great campaign. But this wasn't just a ceasefire or a footnote in diplomatic history, it was a bureaucratic earthquake. With quiet clauses and carefully written annexes, the treaty dismantled old borders, erased ancient republics, and sketched the outline of a new European order. This was empire by ink and boredom, by clauses and cadastral surveys, the kind of power that moves not by armies, but by archivists. Let's slow down and unpack the deliberately dull brilliance of this treaty, and how it helped Napoleon not only defeat an empire, but begin to build his own. Why Campo Formio, a quiet location for a noisy result? Campo Formio wasn't the planned venue for peace negotiations. Originally, diplomacy had begun in Leoben, where Napoleon met with Austrian envoys in the spring of 1797. The fighting was ongoing, but France's advance into Austrian territory had grown so alarming that the Habsburgs offered to negotiate. But the French government, the Directory, delayed. Suspicious of Napoleon's independence and popularity, they feared he might use peace to further his own ambitions. And he did. Rather than wait for instructions from Paris, Napoleon moved the talks to Campo Formio, a remote village with minimal oversight. The setting was strategic. It allowed him to control the pace, the attendees, and the terms. In doing so, he demonstrated that diplomacy, like warfare, was a matter of logistics and initiative. He chose the ground and dictated the tempo not with muskets, but with minutes and draft treaties. The key terms, unpacking the fine print. The Treaty of Campo Formio contained just 17 articles, but each one carried enormous weight. Let's break down its quietly revolutionary content. Round Pushpin 1, Cession of Belgium to France. The Austrian Netherlands, modern-day Belgium, were formally ceded to France. This was a massive territorial gain for the Republic and gave it access to rich ports and industrial zones. Round Pushpin 2, Recognition of the Cisalpine Republic. Austria agreed to recognize the new Cisalpine Republic, a French client state in northern Italy. This legitimized Napoleon's redrawing of Italy's political map and signaled that France was no longer just exporting revolution, it was installing infrastructure. Round Pushpin 3, Austria receives Venice and its empire. In exchange for recognizing France's gains, Austria was compensated with the Venetian Republic, an ancient and once powerful maritime empire. Napoleon had already conquered Venice and dismantled its institutions. Campo Formio simply rubber-stamped the handover. In one paragraph, over 1,000 years of Venetian independence ended. Round Pushpin 4, Left bank of the Rhine to France. Austria agreed that France would control the western bank of the Rhine River, a traditional line of defense and commerce. This expanded France's frontier deep into what is now western Germany. Round Pushpin 5, Secret Clauses, Future Boundary Adjustments. The treaty included secret articles in which Austria and France agreed to further negotiations about German principalities. These hinted at future land swaps and redistricting again, without consulting the smaller German states. This was diplomacy by pencil sketch, with rulers and compasses, not people, in mind. The erasure of Venice, bureaucratic demolition. Few episodes in European history are as quietly shocking as the dismantling of the Venetian Republic. At Campo Formio, Napoleon ceded Venice to Austria, but it wasn't his to give. The city had been neutral when the French entered Italy, but Napoleon, viewing it as a relic of aristocratic stagnation, accused it of colluding with Austria and invaded. In a matter of weeks, the Great Council was dissolved. Venetian currency was replaced with French-backed notes. Art and treasures were seized, including the famous 4 bronze horses from St. Mark's Basilica, later returned. The Venetian fleet was handed over to the Austrians. Venice's system of governance, which had persisted through centuries of European upheaval, was ended not by conquest alone, but by administrative absorption. Napoleon's officers took inventories, changed signage, and filed reports to Paris. It was an empire-ending event carried out with forms and folders. Napoleon's role: soldier, scribe, sovereign. At Campo Formio, Napoleon did not merely relay instructions. He wrote the treaty, often dictating its contents directly to his aides. His presence in the negotiation room was not symbolic, it was commanding. He drafted the preamble, revised the articles, pressured Austrian envoys with both military threats and logistical arguments. When Count Cobenzl protested the loss of Venice, Napoleon responded not with philosophical justification, but with maps and troop positions. He explained, with detached precision, how Austria had already lost the region, in fact, even if not yet in law. This was power as paperwork. Napoleon's vision of diplomacy was not about ideals, it was about establishing facts on the ground, then codifying them in treaty form. He often said, "The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must," echoing Thucydides, not Rousseau. Campo Formio was not an end, it was a filing cabinet entry for future action. Back in Paris, nervous applause. When word of the treaty reached the Directory, reactions were mixed. On one hand, Napoleon had delivered a staggering success. He ended the war with Austria, secured major territorial gains, brought peace at least temporarily to Europe. On the other hand, he had negotiated the treaty largely without oversight, ignored instructions from the foreign ministry, created client republics that owed loyalty to him, not the Directory. And most unsettling of all, he returned with something greater than glory. He returned with a proven model of conquest through administration. The Directory, already unstable, began to whisper. Had they created a man too skilled at war and even more dangerous in peace? Closing thought. The Treaty of Campo Formio was quiet on the surface. No grand declarations, no ceremonial alliances. Just lines redrawn, names replaced, and territories shuffled like pages in a binder. But in that silence was a thunderous message, that the future of Europe would not be written in royal parlors or church councils, but in municipal offices, map rooms, and printing presses. Campo Formio was not just a treaty. It was a proof of concept that with enough control over armies, documents, and direction, one man could shape a continent. And it leaves us with a strange, unsettling question. When a treaty ends a war, but begins a new kind of empire, is it peace, or just a pause between reorganizations? After the ink dried on the Treaty of Campo Formio in October 1797, the cannons fell silent, at least for a time. Europe was no longer at war, but it was also no longer the Europe people had known. With pen strokes and parchment, borders were erased, kingdoms were shuffled, and republics were installed where dukes once ruled. The quiet act of treaty writing had reshaped the continent far more dramatically than many battles before it. But the real legacy of Campo Formio wasn't just territorial, it was administrative. It ushered in a new method of control, one that didn't rely solely on soldiers or flags, but on files, measurements, surveys, and laws. Napoleon, ever the pragmatist, understood something his royal predecessors hadn't. That conquest was only half the task. The real power lay in reorganizing the conquered. In this section, we'll explore how Campo Formio's terms triggered a massive administrative shift, how maps became tools of domination, and how a new vision of governance, impersonal, measured, and methodical, began to spread across Europe. The redrawing of Europe, borders as bureaucratic tools. After Campo Formio, Europe looked different not just aesthetically, but functionally. What had once been a web of feudal holdings, principalities, and semi-autonomous enclaves was now starting to resemble something far more rational. A continent of states and regions, neatly labeled and color-coded on maps. Under Napoleon's guidance, French cartographers and civil engineers launched into action. Maps were standardized, often based on French triangulation systems. Borders were drawn according to natural boundaries, rivers, mountain ranges, not the whims of dynastic marriage. Each new republic or territory came with administrative subdivisions, often called departments, mirroring the French revolutionary model. The goal wasn't just to show where things were, it was to restructure how people were governed. Maps became not just geographic references, but instruments of policy. They dictated taxation zones, conscription areas, and postal routes. A province that was once vaguely defined by tradition or custom was now precisely defined by latitude, longitude, and ledger. And this mattered, because when you can measure something, you can govern it. Triangular ruler, the rise of metrics, a new language of control. Alongside territorial redrawing came another quiet revolution, the spread of the metric system. Developed in revolutionary France, the metric system had begun as a utopian idea, a measurement system based on rational units derived from nature, like the circumference of the Earth. But under Napoleon, it became something far more practical, a tool of empire. After Campo Formio, in newly acquired territories, weights and measures were standardized, eliminating hundreds of local units of length, mass, and volume. Public education promoted the metric system. Merchants and landowners were compelled to convert their accounting and contracts into metric units. This wasn't merely about mathematics, it was about authority. By replacing traditional measurements with metric ones, Napoleon's administrators asserted control over commerce, agriculture, taxation, and trade. A meter stick wasn't just a tool, it was a declaration that the Republic had arrived, and that order now reigned where chaos, or at least inconsistency, once ruled. Classical the new republics, models of micro-governance. Campo Formio confirmed France's hold over the Cisalpine Republic, the Ligurian Republic, and by implication other puppet states such as the Roman Republic and Parthenopean Republic, soon to follow. These entities weren't just protectorates, they were political laboratories. Napoleon's administrators, often low-level bureaucrats, engineers, or lawyers, were sent in to establish prefectures and departmental councils, translate and enforce French civil law, create property records and population censuses, overhaul tax systems based on land productivity and census data. Each task involved volumes of paperwork. Armies of clerks reclassified fields, churches, and town halls. Land was mapped, taxed, and brought under state jurisdiction. In some regions, peasants welcomed the changes, especially the abolition of feudal dues. In others, local elites resisted, seeing French rule not as liberation but colonization via bureaucracy. But whether welcomed or not, these changes endured. Even after Napoleon's eventual fall, many of these administrative reforms, departments, metric units, cadastral surveys remained in place. Bureaucratic conquest had proven more resilient than military victory. Books archiving the revolution, Napoleon's administrative ecosystem. Behind the scenes of Campo Formio's military drama was a sprawling web of record keepers, surveyor generals, postal inspectors, and tax auditors. Napoleon's genius was not just in strategy, but in institutionalizing authority. Every new territory required registries of births, deaths, marriages critical for conscription and inheritance law, tax rolls, updated annually based on production and land use, court records, translated into French and duplicated in official archives, mail routes, often optimized for both communication and intelligence gathering. These systems created an invisible scaffolding of control. A town's mayor no longer answered to a local noble, he answered to a departmental prefect, who answered to a central ministry, who answered to Paris or to Napoleon directly. This vertical structure of accountability, top-down, file-driven, impersonal, would become a model for modern bureaucratic states across Europe. And it all began, quietly, with Campo Formio. Performing arts, the theatrics of simplicity. Campo Formio as political performance. The Treaty of Campo Formio is often viewed as dry legal text, but to Napoleon, it was a performance, one designed to show Europe that France was no longer a nation of chaos, but a manager of systems. He didn't just sign a treaty. He sent detailed reports to Paris, planted stories in the press, and ensured that copies of the treaty were widely distributed and annotated. By choosing a modest location, no palace, no court, he signaled the democratic humility of republican diplomacy. Yet in practice, he had wielded absolute control over its terms. This tension between the performance of simplicity and the reality of command would define his rule. Campo Formio was its first stage. Closing thought. The Treaty of Campo Formio wasn't a pause in history, it was a pivot. In its quiet clauses and measured boundaries, it taught Europe that wars could be won not just by generals, but by surveyors, scribes, and statisticians. It introduced a new idea of empire, one built not on lineage or tradition, but on metric conversion tables, fiscal codes, and municipal filings. And it leaves us with an unsettling question. When the most powerful tool in war becomes the ledger, not the lance, what kind of empire emerges next? The ink on the Treaty of Campo Formio was barely dry when it began to show its cracks. Though presented as a conclusive peace between revolutionary France and Austria, the treaty was never intended to last. Its clauses had barely been implemented before new conflicts arose. The Republic was expanding. Napoleon's ambitions were fermenting. Austria was licking its wounds, and the rest of Europe was watching uneasily. In this final section of Story 6, we'll examine how the peace at Campo Formio unraveled, the quiet revolutions it sparked in governance, and how it laid the intellectual and infrastructural foundation for a very different kind of empire, one that would outlive Napoleon himself. Let us return to 1798, a Europe at rest in name only, and see how the dull details of a rural treaty table became the blueprint for bureaucratic domination. Campo Formio's legal fragility. Like many treaties before it, Campo Formio functioned less as a lasting agreement and more as a temporary declaration of exhaustion. It was peace by necessity, not conviction. Key signs of its fragility included secret articles. Some terms were not disclosed publicly, including territorial adjustments in the Holy Roman Empire. This created confusion and resentment among smaller German states. Delayed implementation. Many territorial exchanges, particularly in the Rhineland, were still being negotiated months later at the Congress of Rastatt, an effort to formalize the terms that never completed. Austrians' quiet defiance. Though they accepted French territorial gains, the Habsburgs never accepted French dominance in Italy. Their diplomats continued to maneuver behind the scenes, sowing seeds for renewed conflict. British resistance. Britain had refused to participate in the negotiations. To them, Campo Formio was not a peace, it was a French reorganization of the battlefield. In short, Campo Formio was a ceasefire under the guise of settlement, and everyone involved knew it. From armies to administrators, governing the gains. What happened after Campo Formio was arguably more important than the treaty itself. Napoleon returned to Paris not just as a victor, but as the author of new states. Under his direct oversight, the Cisalpine Republic and other client entities developed constitutions written in French and Italian, reflecting the ideals of Enlightenment centralism. Central banks to collect taxes and pay public employees. Secular school systems, replacing religious instruction with civic curricula. New elites often chosen not for birth, but for loyalty, language skills, or mathematical ability. These governments mirrored French republican institutions, but beneath their facades, they were entirely dependent on French military and fiscal support. The real power didn't lie in the legislative assemblies, it lay in the prefect's office, in budgets, land surveys, conscription rolls, and registry books. This was the beginning of Napoleon's real genius, using bureaucracy as the glue of conquest. The loop of revolt and reorganization. One often overlooked detail in the aftermath of Campo Formio is just how quickly the new order came under strain. In Venice, resentment of Austrian occupation boiled over. In Naples, the Parthenopean Republic was short-lived, collapsed by royalist mobs within months of its founding. In the Papal States, civil unrest prompted the establishment of the Roman Republic, with French backing, in 1798. In Switzerland, the Helvetic Republic was established with French encouragement again, using the same model of administrative control. In each case, French intervention followed the same playbook. Support or provoke a revolutionary uprising. Dismantle the old institutions of monarchy, guilds, or clergy. Establish a new republic with departments, civil codes, taxes, and metric systems. Station a French garrison to defend liberty and ensure compliance. This became the loop of Napoleonic soft conquest, repeatable, exportable, boringly efficient. Yet beneath the surface, local resistance always simmered. The people knew that liberty without autonomy was just a new kind of yoke, measured in kilograms and signed in triplicate. Paper empires and the dream of order. The irony of Campo Formio is that it did more than create peace, it created work. Massive work, generations of it. Archivists, mapmakers, notaries, and jurists across Europe were now tasked with translating old feudal documents into modern property records, reconciling traditional customs with French civil law, educating the population about new currency, weights, and laws, redrawing local jurisdictions to align with Paris-approved geometries. This was not the thrilling kind of empire. There were no grand coronations or epic battles. It was endless surveying, registering, and retraining. Yet this administrative infrastructure, often boring, often unseen, would outlast the Napoleonic Wars. In fact, it would outlast Napoleon himself. By the mid-19th century, even after his fall, countries like Italy and Germany would adopt similar administrative models when unifying. The echoes of Campo Formio and the systems it normalized can be found in modern European governance to this day. Campo Formio's quiet death. In 1799, just 2 years after the treaty, the Second Coalition War broke out. Austria re-entered the fray. The Congress of Rastatt, meant to finalize Campo Formio's adjustments, ended abruptly when French envoys were murdered, likely by Austrian agents. The treaty, like so many before it, collapsed under the weight of ambition. Napoleon, now back from Egypt, seized power in France by coup d'état in November 1799. The Directory, the very government he had nominally represented at Campo Formio, was dismantled. He would soon crown himself emperor, rewrite many of the very constitutions he had once imposed in Italy, and transform republics into provinces. Campo Formio died quietly, not in battle but in irrelevance. Its clauses superseded, its states reorganized, its purpose fulfilled and discarded. And yet, in its ephemeral lifespan, it gave Europe a glimpse of something new. A world governed not by bloodlines and thrones, but by bureaucracy and balance sheets. Final reflection. The Treaty of Campo Formio is rarely romanticized. There are no ballads sung about it, no dramatic paintings. It has no Versailles grandeur, no Yalta showmanship. It was, by all accounts, tedious. But its significance lies precisely in that dullness. It marked the moment when power became procedural, when borders were redrawn not by birthright, but by measurement and negotiation. Napoleon showed that empires could be built not just by horses and heroes, but by clerks and coordinates. And so we are left with a quiet but profound question. When history is written in pencil, on maps and in minutes, what erasures are we living inside of even now?